Enjoy early access to ad-free episodes each week when you subscribe to Wedding Planning Podcast Premium in Apple Podcasts. Enjoy the show. Raise your hand for me if you are completely drowning in wedding etiquette and rules. Everyone out there has an opinion on invitation wording, cash bars, inviting children, wedding day transportation, and of course, what traditions absolutely have to be included in the wedding day. There's nothing like planning a wedding to suddenly have everyone you've ever known come out of the woodwork with their opinions. Am I right? Where wedding planning gets really overwhelming for some couples is when our ideas of what a wedding, quote, should look like are in conflict with our budget, our wants, and our personalities. And of course, an added layer of stress arises when you and your partner come from different backgrounds. Maybe you have different ideas of what a wedding, quote, should look like. For example, one of you thinks paying $10,000 for a photographer is completely reasonable, and the other one wants to spend $10,000 total on the entire wedding. But no matter where you're from, what your backgrounds are, I am always a firm believer in your wedding day being an expression and a celebration of you and your partner. At the end of the day, the two of you are making a really special commitment to one another, and you're looking to celebrate that occasion with all of your closest loved ones. That's it. It's pretty simple. So with that said, let's spend today looking at some common wedding etiquette points or wedding, quote, rules. And let's kind of see these rules and etiquette things with a fresh set of eyes. And a quick spoiler alert before we dive in. I don't necessarily have a right and wrong or an okay, not okay answer for every single piece of etiquette and rules that we're going to go over today, because look, there is so much gray area here. I could sit all day and say it's never okay to do that. It's always better to do this, but that's not reality. That's not the world that we live in. I thought it would be helpful for us to take a list of these common etiquette and rules items that are flying around out there in internet land and to have a critical conversation about each one of them so that you can maybe see it from a different point of view, look at it with a fresh set of eyes, and ultimately decide what's right for you. Which leads perfectly into my next point, which is please trust that you always have the support from me to ditch what everyone else is doing and to design your wedding celebration for you. And of course, this doesn't mean being blatantly rude or disagreeable to your family or sneaking behind your partner's back to sabotage something that you know they really want. Or, of course, failing to honor your guests who are committing significant time and resources to participate in your wedding and to be there to support you. Of course, you have responsibilities to all of your relationships. And of course, obviously, we will always use common sense and a spirit of compromise and understanding throughout your engagement as you navigate these challenges. So here's a roundup of some commonly held wedding etiquette rules and beliefs that, in my opinion, can by all means be adjusted and be updated so that they serve you and your unique priorities when it comes to planning out your wedding. With that, let's get started and let's reinvent some of these old, outdated wedding etiquette and rules, starting with wedding invitations. And there is plenty to talk about here. First off, thank goodness we've gotten on board with sending digital invitations because let me tell you, when I started hosting the Wedding Planning Podcast back in 2015. Whoa, that's a long time ago. Believe it or not, we were still not all on the same page and fully embracing of sending out a digital invitation. Now, there might still be some folks out there who are digging their heels in and really committing to the old school way and do believe that you always have to send a physical invitation. I'm not one of them. I don't feel that way at all. But if we rewind just 5 years, I'd say I've done multiple versions of this etiquette theme show over the years. And one of the topics from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago was presenting the argument for digital invitations versus, at the time, the commonly held etiquette that, again, nothing but a paper invitation was acceptable. If you're out there in an echo chamber of moms and aunts and grandmas who are trying to convince you that you have to send paper invitations, please send them my way, and I'm happy to do my best to convince them otherwise. If you are planning to send out physical invitations, which, by the way, I am in full support of, you'll find a plethora of etiquette and rules about everything from how to address them, what enclosures to include, what not to include, and how far in advance you should send them. This is a huge topic, and we could literally spend an entire show on just invitations alone. But for our purposes today, I'll summarize the whole thing by saying, look up on the internet how an invitation should be addressed, what should be included, and then use it as a loose guideline and then make it your own. Cater it to your unique situation. In terms of how far in advance you should send out your invites, you're going to see pretty much across the board, 4 to 6 weeks is the standard answer, the standard rule, if you will. And this is a rare occasion where I will adamantly and outright disagree. I do not think 4 to 6 weeks is enough time, and I would highly recommend doing yourselves a big favor and buy yourself way more time to round up all of your RSVPs and make those final plans. If I had it my way, I would like to rewrite the entire internet to say that it's perfectly fine to send your invitations 4 to 6 months in advance, not 4 to 6 weeks in advance. So again, take those guidelines how you will and cater it to your situation. Another popular invitation etiquette point that's flying around out there is to not include your registry information on your invitation, but rather to use the invite to create a breadcrumb trail that ultimately leads to your wedding website, where it is acceptable to place your registry information. Did you follow me along there? It's a little bit silly. Now, I can see countless situations where this piece of etiquette advice just doesn't make any sense. We're not making a wedding website. We're not sending save the dates. Our guests will ask where we are registered. So why not just include this information in small print at the bottom of our invitation? I always like to flip the scenario. And so here I would ask myself, if I were to open a wedding invitation from a friend and see tiny print on the bottom line with their gift registry information, would I bat an eye at that? And the answer is no. I personally wouldn't. I would actually, on the other hand, I would actually think, wow, that's super convenient. Now I don't have to ask around to find out where they're registered because they included that information right there on the invitation. And moving right along to round out our etiquette conversation on invitations, I'm going to share a listener note with some questions that she has about not sending save the dates. So her note reads, my fiance and I are planning on only sending invitations, not save the dates. We're having a hard time grasping the need to send save the dates and not just going straight to invitations with a QR code for our wedding website. I'm curious about your thoughts on this and if there are certain reactions that we should expect if we don't send save the dates. All right, so my response here is that save the dates are a great example of something that we've come to feel that we, quote, have to send or, quote, should send, when in reality, there are endless workarounds and alternatives, including exactly what this listener has outlined she's doing, which is not sending them at all. I do love the idea of sending your invitation with a QR code about a year in advance, and then you can call it a day. Nothing more is required. This is a great way to skip the expense and the added step of sending save the dates, designing them, paying for them, mailing them, and keeping things really simple is always a win in my book. When you do send a save the date, you're already committed to a wedding date. Obviously, that's the point of sending it. And I am 100% behind the etiquette that everyone who receives a save the date, absolutely 100% also should receive a wedding invitation. So if you really think about this wedding tradition using logic and common sense, there is no real need to send both. Will some guests think that it's strange and wonder where their actual invitation is come next July, August, in the months leading up to your wedding day? Probably. And in terms of things that you can anticipate and questions that you can anticipate, you'll want to double down on the messaging that this one invitation is serving as their formal official invitation to your wedding. And it's also helpful for you to have people close to you reinforce that message as your family and friends interact with one another over the coming months, and people naturally will have questions come up and be chattering back and forth. So if you have an army of people who can reiterate your intention, that's great. The only downside I see to not sending a formal invitation closer to your wedding is that you're going to want a way to communicate some last minute logistics that you may not have ironed out as we sit here today a year in advance. So, for example, I would venture to say that the average person is not going to necessarily have the physical invitation card at their fingertips in 1 year from now. I can pretty much hear this conversation now in my own head between me and my husband. Where did you put Marissa and Matt's wedding invitation that we got last fall? And he would say, I set it right there in that drawer with all of our other important mail. And my response would be, well, I can't find it. Do you remember their wedding website? What was that? I can't remember it. And you get the point. So if this is something that you're interested in doing, I would brainstorm some ways to have some kind of digital process for circling back with people next year to go ahead and present to them any last minute reminders, directions, updates, another link to your website in case they've misplaced that information. I think that would be a great way to anticipate people just needing one extra reminder in the weeks leading up to your actual wedding. And this could be done by email, by individual, or even small group text that you send out to your family and your friend circles. It could even be done inside a Facebook group, which I love and I've talked about in past episodes, specifically the show that we did outlining how to create your wedding website. So I will put a reminder link in today's show notes and also in today's email recap about exactly how to set up a Facebook group. It is very easy and it's a great way to communicate with people if this is something that you think your family and friends would appreciate and benefit from. All right, moving right into wedding quote rule number 2. And that is that a wedding ceremony and reception consist of certain traditions that should be included. So for example, here we're thinking the garter toss, your cake cutting, smashing cake in each other's faces, your first dances with mom and or dad, unity candles, money dances, having flower girls, having a traditional looking wedding party. If you're finding yourselves planning your entire reception timeline and ceremony contents around a bunch of traditions that are feeling meaningless to you, then tune in. Stop your multitasking because this part's for you. So for example, let me elaborate on just one that is so strange. Why on earth would your groom reach up your dress in front of everyone and then throw a lacy elastic garter to all the waiting, screaming, and yelling guys at your wedding? John and I, this is my husband, we did do the traditional garter toss at our reception, and it was... oh man, it was such an awkward 60 seconds. It was just so weird. And as soon as it started unfolding, I just immediately felt like, why are we doing this? If I had to do it over again, I would definitely 1,000% not do that. And that's just one example of a reception tradition that John and I just kind of thought we had to include because every wedding we had ever been to, we had seen that done. So why wouldn't we do the same? Clearly, I did not have a wedding planning podcast informing me that I could indeed say no to things that felt weird, awkward, and or strange. So here we are. I'm happy to hopefully be that spokesperson for you. And I want to share really every tradition or quote rule about what you should include during your ceremony and your reception is completely flexible, in my opinion. Now, I know there are religious traditions that you may feel bound to just because of your faith and your family. That's kind of a different category than what we're talking about here. I'm thinking your first dances, who's walking who down the aisle, announcements of the wedding party, speeches, bouquet tosses, unity ceremonies. All these traditions, they can be guidelines, and by all means, if they speak to you and you are excited about doing them, then absolutely do them. But please don't ever feel bad about making a revision or an update or a twist and then cutting out the things that really don't speak to you and your beliefs, your priorities, and your relationships. And if there are elements that are deeply rooted within your faith, your religion, your family traditions, and you feel like you're going to be disappointing your parents or any other loved ones, then that's maybe a deeper conversation than like, hey guys, we're deciding not to do a garter toss. So I just want to be specific that I am keeping those two different things in different categories. I'm not implying that you should just blow off a really deep-rooted important family tradition that you may have. Susan's Travel Services is so excited to partner with you to plan your honeymoon, destination wedding, or maybe even your bachelor or bachelorette party. Susan and her team have been planning dream vacations for 27 years, and they are truly the best in the business for start to finish planning services. Travel and new experiences are incredibly special to me, and Susan and her team have helped me plan some unforgettable vacations, including a bachelorette party in Cabo and a family anniversary celebration in Cancun. They meticulously researched the best all-inclusive options for us based on some very specific priorities, and the professional assistance in choosing location, resort, activities, and transportation was absolutely priceless. From all-inclusive resorts in Mexico and the Caribbean, overwater bungalows in the Maldives, or that African safari that you've always dreamed of, save yourself hours of research and guesswork and let Susan and her team find you the best options for a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. Reach out to Susan and her team today by emailing info@susanstravelservices.com. And be sure to let her know that I sent you and get $50 off your final booking or $200 off your destination wedding. Her email one more time is info@susanstravelservices.com. Here's a huge one that starts so many back and forth verbal brawls on internet chat rooms about wedding planning, and that is the etiquette surrounding hosting a cash bar. So in other words, a cash bar is when you are having your guests pay for alcoholic and or non-alcoholic, I suppose it could be either, but you're asking your guests to pay for their drinks. You've probably found by now that for so much of your wedding planning journey, you're walking a tightrope between creating a great experience for you and your guests, and on the other side, you're trying to balance creating a great experience for your bank account. And what's extremely tacky and not good self-love etiquette whatsoever, in my opinion, is going into massive debt for a wedding that is much more expensive than what you can afford. So if picking up the tab for 200 of your family and friends to drink bottomless booze all night long, if that is outside the scope of what you can afford to host, then I would highly, highly, highly suggest that we explore some creative alternatives because there are many of them. Now, there's a huge number of things you can do that exist in a gray area between, on one far dramatic end of the spectrum, you have hosting a dry wedding, just having no alcohol at all. And then on the other opposite end of that spectrum, you've got a wide open top shelf bar. Between those two things, there are so many ways that you can be creative and still offer your guests alcoholic drinks if you choose, and it does not involve asking them, your guests, to pay for things. So let's do a quick overview here of some options for alcohol service if you're cost conscious and looking to control this expense. And if this is a topic that you'd like to do a deeper dive on, please be in touch because I personally am happy to talk about cocktails anytime, any day. And I would love to create a larger show just out of your bar if that's something that would be helpful. Okay, so on our one extreme, let's just say we cut out the alcohol, it's completely removed from the equation, you host a dry wedding, and that is a great option for some couples. And then on the other end of our spectrum, we have an open bar, and that can realistically cost anywhere from $40 to $100 and way on up from there per person. And obviously that's a huge range in prices. I understand. Depending on your location and the market that you're located in, there is a wide difference. So that's something you need to do some local research on to get yourself a really solid idea of how much to budget for the bar. And if you're already saying, even on the cheap end of that spectrum, $40 a person times 100 guests, that's $4,000. That is way out of our budget. So forget it. We are just going to do a cash bar and people can pay for their own drinks if they want to drink. So before you do that, before you just give up and feel like there's no other way, let's just live in the gray area for a minute and explore some things. So if serving beer, wine, and some cocktails is a priority to you, then let's get creative about some ways to make it fit within your budget so that you're not asking your guests to pay for their own drinks. Number one idea, you can prioritize a venue that lets you stock your own bar, and then you can either hire a bartender, or oftentimes your venue will have a bartender there that you can use. For a very cost-effective way of doing this, you can stick with beer and wine only. You can restrict cocktails to well liquor, so forget the top shelf stuff and just have people call vodka soda, whiskey coke, etc. You could designate 1 or 2 specialty cocktails that can be pre-made in a big, huge batch and just served kind of punch style. And you can dress them up with some fun garnishes, make it more like a fancy cocktail. But it doesn't cost a ton to buy a few bottles of rum, vodka, whatever it is, and make a fun cocktail in a big, huge batch. You can also do, so popular right now, canned seltzers. There are literally a bazillion options. There's kombucha. There are pre-mixed cocktails that come right in a can. I love those. They're so convenient for barbecuing. You can chill them on ice and you don't need to be worrying about mixing things and having multiple bottles laying around. So easy. I could go on and on. I'm going to stop there. But again, if you want to do a deeper dive on this, I'm happy to dedicate a show to budget-friendly beer, wine, cocktails. Shoot me a note and let me know. And to wrap up the topic of cash bars, my feelings about hosting a cash bar have evolved over the past few years. If you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said without hesitation, you know what? If alcohol is not in your budget and you still want to offer the option, then asking people to pay for it themselves is fine. Today, I hesitate a little bit more only because, like I said just a minute ago, There are so many workarounds and options to providing drinks at a reasonable price point that I just can't justify asking your guests to be the one to foot the bill for that. And of course, obviously, I said it before, it's worth saying again, if serving alcohol isn't a priority to you and your partner, and you're not willing to factor it into your catering budget, then just skip it and it's not a big deal. And then funny, I'm going to put this in here because it kind of fits on the topic of asking your guests to pay for things. I think we can all agree that downright charging your guests money to attend your wedding, so literally selling tickets to your wedding, to your friends and family, this is not great etiquette, right? Can we all agree on that? And yet, lo and behold, I stumbled across a New York Times article just the other day featuring couples who are actually doing that. One couple was charging $450 for a ticket to their wedding. Another was charging $333. So random. And it was the craziest story. And I thought of you when I came across it. I'll include a link in the show notes to read the full story if you'd like to explore that craziness a little bit more. Definitely pushing the boundaries of wedding etiquette there. Our next wedding etiquette rule that I would like to explore and revise quite a bit is that the focus should be entirely on your guests. Your sole job is to make sure that your guests have an amazing experience at your wedding. Let's dig into this one. So first of all, unless you are charging your guests admission, like the couples in the article that I just mentioned before, then you, my friend, are the one footing the bill. Now, of course, you're going to go out of your way to reasonably accommodate your guests, but that does not mean that you need to go broke in the process of doing so. So we start putting plans into place. We're thinking about our guests. It's drilled into us everywhere from everyone. The focus is on your guests. The focus is on your guests. We got to make a good experience for our guests. What if people are upset about having to wait a couple of hours between the reception and the ceremony? What if people think we're cheap because we're only offering beer and wine and they want cocktails? What if someone is inconvenienced because we're not hosting full service transportation? Well, here's a spoiler alert for you. Someone will always criticize what you did and what you didn't do. And worrying about trying to please everyone is a losing battle every single time. And making everyone's experience at your wedding perfectly flawless is not realistic, and it's not your job. So if transportation is simply not in your budget, and the only way you can make your ceremony and reception work is to have a 3-hour break in between, then please save yourself the heartache of going on the internet and looking up the etiquette and the rules about doing those things, because then you're going to feel bad about your decisions. And instead, just say, look, we're doing the best we can to take care of everyone, with the ultimate intention being to spend time celebrating with the people we love. And that's it. Do your best. It does not need to be perfect. And another wedding rule that I would love to just toss out the window are old-fashioned ideas about who pays for what. So all the old guidelines about who pays for what have more or less gone completely out the window at this point. I'm not suggesting that the specific breakdown of who pays for what never happens anymore. Of course it does. Back to our earlier conversation about your location, your culture, your family traditions. Of course, those traditional financial roles still apply and may apply to your situation. I'm merely suggesting here in this part of our conversation that if you are engaged and assuming that your parents will be paying for the wedding without having an explicit conversation with them, then I recommend having a meeting ASAP to make sure that you're all on the same page. For all of my friends, fans out there, remember the episode where Monica and Chandler got engaged and she went to ask her mom and dad for the wedding money? And her dad said, "Oh, honey, that's what we call the beach house." See, exactly. Monica was assuming that her parents were paying for this entire wedding, and then come to find out they didn't have any money to offer her. Most of the couples who I work with via this podcast, they finance some, if not most, if not all, of the wedding planning themselves. So I don't know what that means. It could be a commentary on our generation. It could be characteristic of podcast listeners in general. It could be a combination of those two things. I just think it's kind of a generational shift. And the bottom line is, it is definitely never safe to assume that your parents are going to be footing the bill for your dream wedding without having an outright conversation with them about who will be paying for what, if anything. And trust me, I know that talking about money can be awkward and uncomfortable for some of us. And on the note of etiquette, outright asking for money is not going to pass any etiquette test. But in this case, a candid conversation is required so that you're not operating on guesswork and you're not booking a bunch of things that you actually can't afford. If your parents or any other family have indicated that they would like to help you with the wedding, then it's modern common sense to find out if that means helping with $1,000 or it means helping with $20,000. You know your family's best, so it's impossible for me to dictate exactly how this conversation is going to go down, but please do yourselves a favor and ask the questions and find out the answer. And if the answer continues to be vague and non-committal and you can't figure out if they do mean $1,000 or $20,000, I'm bringing this up. It may sound weird. And again, I know it's kind of an awkward conversation for most of us to have. I get that. But this comes up so often, so often. And couples get stuck. They get in trouble because they're assuming one thing and then it never comes to fruition. So if they can't give you an answer, they can't commit, they think it's rude of you to ask, they just want to give you a gift without feeling pressured to give you a certain amount, whatever. If the answer is we don't know, then I would suggest that you proceed as if it will be zero money, $0, and go ahead and plan the wedding that you can afford without their assistance. And if any money is gifted in the future, then that's a surprise bonus that can go towards a honeymoon, a down payment on a house, paying off a car, whatever it is. Okay, on that note, we are going to wrap up today's show on wedding etiquette and rules. I really hope you found our conversation useful, and I hope that you got inspired with a new idea or two, maybe a fresh way of looking at something. If there's any specific wedding etiquette topics that you are struggling with, I would love to hear about those. We can do a follow-up segment on a future show, and you can be in touch anytime with me by visiting the website, weddingplanningpodcast.co/contact. Thank you as always for tuning in, and don't forget to follow the Wedding Planning Podcast wherever you listen for automatic free downloads each week. You can also visit our website to sign up for weekly show recaps via email. And that website, one more time, weddingplanningpodcast.co. And last thing, if you're loving our time together each week, please take just a few seconds to leave a 5-star rating and review. It really helps the show, and I would super appreciate it. Thank you again for being here, and we'll meet again next week, same time, same place.